how did Abram's relationship with God begin? It started with God speaking to him. And when God spoke to Abram, he made promises to Abram. God appears to Abram and speaks to him. Let's read Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord said to Abram, in Genesis 12:7, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, the Lord spoke, the Lord appeared, the Lord made himself known to Abram. Now, in this story, we don't know much about what happened to Abram before this God appearing to Abram. So maybe Abram was seeking God and really asking for God to come to him. But what we know is that God was seeking Abram. God was seeking to have relationship with man. And today he's still seeking to have that relationship with us. God is the one who came and initiated. God was the one who came and started the relationship. And he does that with us today. He draws us. We sense his presence around us, and we know, I have to do something to respond and come close to him. But God comes and makes a relationship with us. And the fact that God is seeking out people is so amazing, isn't it? He is seeking people to have a relationship with. And as God seeks out Abram, he does two things with him. He gives him commands, and he gives him promises. The command that God gave to Abram was to go to the land that I will show you. I think it's really interesting to think about the command that God gave to Abram. God simply comes and says, okay, Abram, leave your father, leave everything, leave your home, leave your land, and go to the land I will show you. Now, for many of us, listening to God and going, even if God gave us a specific place to go to, is really difficult, isn't it? If God says, move to Incheon tomorrow, some of us would really struggle with that. Well, I live here. Why do I want to go there? And we find it really difficult. But what did God say to Abram? He just said, leave. Leave. And after you leave, and as you're on your way, I'll show you later where it is you're going to. And I think we find that even more difficult. But the truth is, that's really the way it is with God so often, isn't it? We take one step at a time, and we hear God speaking to us, and we take a step. And where that step is going to lead us, we often don't know. And where the end of that is, we don't know. Now, in my own life, there have been a number of times when I've really felt like God has spoken to me clearly about what I needed to do. Now, when I say God spoke to me clearly, it's not like I heard a voice, but through circumstances, through prayer, through worship, I sensed in my heart, I felt in my spirit, I knew in my mind that this was a step that God wanted me to take. And so I began on journeys. And those journeys that I began led me to places I never thought I would go. And one of the most memorable for me, one of the ones that has the most impact on my life, I think I've shared with you before, but I'll share it again today, was my first year of college. I went to a Christian university called Asbury College, and as we started the year, each quarter we would have a special spiritual emphasis week. And that would be a week of services in the evening where we would have worship, where we would have teaching. And in the fall, we had what we would call the fall revival. So first year at the school, we're at the fall revival. There was a really good message that really spoke to me, except I can't remember at all what the message was now. I remember who was speaking, but I can't remember the exact message. And at the end of the message, there was an opportunity to come forward to the altar and pray. Now, in the past, whenever there was that kind of opportunity for me to go and pray, I always knew beforehand what God wanted me to do at the altar. Maybe there was a sin in my life that I knew I needed to confess. Maybe there had been a fight that I had just had with someone and I need to ask for more patience. But I would go for prayer knowing what it was I was praying for. This time was really different. I really felt like God just said, go and pray. And I was like, but about what, God? He just said, go and pray. I said, okay. So I went down to the altar and I prayed. And God really spoke to me from Romans 12, 1 to 3. And in Romans 12, 1 to 3, it speaks about offering your life as as a living sacrifice. And that as you offer your life as a living sacrifice, that is your spiritual act of worship to God. And so I felt like I had to offer my life to God. And as I offered my life to God, what God was saying to me was, your life should be about the nations, about the world. Usually when we look at Genesis 12:3, and as we look at Genesis 12, 1 to 3, we speak about God's love for the nations, because God says he will bless Abram, and he will bless the nations through Abram. God has always had a heart to reach out to all nations. And at that time, I felt like God said, this has got to be the center of your life. My heart for all nations, for all peoples, for all languages, for all tribes, has got to be center to everything you do. Now at that time, I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know if that meant I was going to go overseas. I didn't know if that meant I would pray for others. But I knew that that had to be what was center to everything I did in my life. And the result of that has been that I have wandered all over the world. I've been to many different countries. If you had asked me even 4 years ago, will you live in Korea? I would have thought, no, I'm never going to live in Korea. God has led me to places I never thought I would have gone. In fact, some of the countries I've been to did not even exist. I'm going to show my age here. In 1989, well actually 1985 when this happened, some of the countries came into being since that point. And so it was very much similar, this idea that God is leading me to something that he wants me to do, but the steps and where it's going to end up were not clear. The second part of what God was saying to Abram was the promise. Genesis 12, 2 to 3 says that God will make Abram into a great nation, and God will bless Abram, and God will bless those who bless Abram, and Abram will bless all the nations. God is saying that his way of reaching all the nations and all the peoples would be through Abram. You see, God was calling Abram to do something. Go to this land. And if you obey me, I am going to bless you. But you know what? God doesn't bless us just so that we can be blessed. And I think in today's world, so often, that's the way we want to think of God. God, bless me. God, give me what I need. And we want that blessing from God. And that's good, in a way, because God does want to bless us. But there's a reason God blesses us. And God blesses us so that we can bless others. God pulls us aside as his people and fills us with his Spirit and his love and his grace so that we can take that and give it to others. And that's what we see in Genesis. That's what we see in these verses as God calls Abram. He gives him this promise. But the promise of blessing is not just for Abram's sake, but it is for the sake of others. When we see God blessing us, we need to understand that that blessing is not just for us. Now, when I lived overseas, I was living on support. I was living without the same amount of money coming in every month. But there was generally a normal amount of finances that I would have each month, and I could know how much I would have to live on. And I learned over the years that sometimes God would really bless me, and I would get more finances than I normally had. And if that happened, I knew one of two things was about to happen. The first is I was going to have an unexpected crisis. There was going to be an expense I did not know about. There was going to be a trip I did not know about. There was going to be something coming up that I did not know about that I was going to need money for. And so God was giving the money before I needed it. The other thing was someone else was going to have a crisis. Someone else was going to have a need. And I remember one time very clearly, there was a friend of mine that needed some finances for a ministry he was doing. He was a local Christian from a Central Asian country, and he was doing legal work for Christians in that country. And so when the Christians would be persecuted, he would be the lawyer who would go and defend them. And he needed extra finances for some of the work he was doing. And God surprisingly gave me enough money that I was able to help him with his ministry. And I've learned that whenever God blesses me, it's not just so that I can stick it away and get something for myself. It's because God has someone intended for me to bless. And I have to be looking. And I've learned that whenever God blesses me, I open my eyes and start looking around. Okay, what is the need God has that he's blessed me with this for? God blessing comes so that we can bless others. God speaks and appears to us. And just like God spoke and appeared to Abram, God speaks and appears to us. And when he does, he gives us commands and he gives us promises. But there's something else we can learn from Abram. We can learn that God appears to us. But we also have to learn that we have to take a step. We have to obey. Genesis 12:4 simply says that then Abram went as the Lord told him. Isn't that a really challenging statement? And Abram went as the Lord told him. God appears to Abram and says, leave. And Abram goes, okay, let's go, family. And off they go. Now again, I think these stories are shortened and we don't see the struggles that probably went on, but we see the point. God spoke and Abram obeyed. When we hear God's voice, we have to take the step that God is showing them to go. And it sounds simple, but often it's much more difficult than that. But the truth is, if we want to see the promises, if we want to see the promises that God has given, he had to go. If Abram wanted to see the promise fulfilled that I will make you into a great nation, he had to obey. He had to take a step. He had to go. We have to act and trust God in what we do. As I went forward and decided to go to Central Asia, there was a long process of prayer and consulting with others, fasting, really seeking God that this was the right thing for me to do. But at the end of the day, I had to take a step. I had to get on an airplane. I had to make plans. I couldn't just hear God's voice. I had to respond to it. And as we listen to God, it won't always be easy. We read the stories of Abram. We read the stories of the Old Testament. And we think, wow, sometimes it must have been easy for them. He heard the voice of God. He listened to the voice of God. He went to Canaan. And that was it. But the reality is, even if we're walking in what God has called us to do, there are times when it's really, really difficult. There are times when we stop and we just say, what am I doing here? Why did God lead me here? But in the end, he always meets us and gives us that fulfillment of his promise. And we understand what he was that he was doing through us. God appeared to Abram a second time in Genesis 12:7. And he said, I will give your offspring this land. God said he would show Abram the land. And when Abram arrived in that land, he showed him that that was the land. And this was the land your offspring will have. If we want to see God's promises fulfilled in our lives, we have to take a step. And then there's a third lesson from Abram. And this also has to do with response. The first response is that we have to act, we have to obey. The second response is we have to worship and we have to remember. God appears to him and commands Abram and gives Abram promises. Abram steps out and trusts God, and he goes. And when he gets there, God fulfills the promise and says, yes, this is the land I am going to give to your offspring. And then what does Abram do? He builds an altar. Let's read Genesis 12:7. So he built an altar there. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then again in Genesis 12:8, he moved on to another location, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Abram would build an altar to the Lord and call on the name of the Lord from that altar. When I told my story, and when I was at my college, there was an altar. And that altar actually is a really meaningful altar because Asbury College has had a number of revivals. There's been times when God has just appeared at the college and they've stopped classes for a week long and people just came to the altar seeking God. And so this altar is a place where people go back to and they remember, this is where I've met God before, and I go back to that place and I seek God again. Now, when we talk about altars, it's something we have to be a little bit careful with because God is with us wherever we are. And so we don't have to go to a specific location to find God. But there are those places that are special to us where we meet God. For me, there are some places that I remember that God met me in these places. It might be at my college. It might be in an apartment that I had. It might be at a friend's apartment where God really spoke to me about my next step. It might be up in Namhansang Song where there's a little stream and there's a little rock right by the stream. And when I really need something and I'm struggling and I need a special touch from God, I'll walk up there and I'll spend time in that little area because that's a place where God has met with me a couple times. And I go back to those places where God has met with me and I seek him anew and afresh in my life. It's also communion. communion is an altar. It's a place where we come to and we say, God, as I remember what you did for me, as I remember what Christ did on the cross, where he died for me and shed his blood that my sins might be forgiven and I might have relationship with you, I'm going to go back to that place and I'm going to seek you. And I'm going to seek a new connection with you. I'm going to seek new direction from you. I'm going to seek new input from your spirit. And sometimes these altars are very physical places. They're locations, like I talked about up in the mountains. Sometimes it's just a memory. It's a recollection of what God has done for you in the past. And you say, God, I'm hungry for you again. And I'm going to remind you that 10 years ago, this is what you did in my life. And you're the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so if you met me 10 years ago, I believe you can meet me again. And these altars are places we build for memory, to remind ourselves of what God has done for us. And I find it really interesting as you read through the Old Testament, whenever God moved in people's lives, they built altars. Altars to remind themselves of what God had done. And they go back to those altars and say, God, you worked in my life in this place before, and I expect you to do it again, because you are the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so from Abram we learn that our response to what God has done in our lives is to build altars, to build places of remembrance, to build places where we go back to and worship him again. And I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to build altars, places where you have met God, and remember the activity, to remember what God has done for you in the past, so that you can meet him again, and he can do it in your life again. You know, Abram was a man just like us. And we can learn from him about our relationship with God. And I think today there's three things that we learn about Abram and our relationship with God. The first is that God does come and speak to us. That should excite us. God does come and speak to us, and he challenges us with commands, and he gives us promises. And he initiates that. He comes to us. He also responds to us. If we are seeking him, he will respond, and he will be found by us. Second, we have to make a move. We can't just simply say, great, I've heard God, wasn't that awesome? But we have to respond. We have to move. We have to listen. And God will go with us, and he will fulfill the promises he's given us. But we have to take a step ourselves. And then third, we need to remember. We need to remember what he's done. We need to build altars, reminders, mental and physical, of what God has done for us, and continue to seek him for the future in those places. I encourage you this week to think over your life. Where has God really met with you? What has God really done for you that you remember? And make those memories an altar that you can go back to and seek for more and more of him. And in your small groups this afternoon, share with each other. Share with each other what are the special places where God has spoken to you, where you have met with God, and encourage each other that we can seek him anew and afresh. And as we take communion this afternoon, I encourage you to make this time of communion an altar, a place where you say, God, as I remember what you've done for me in the past, I'm going to seek you for what you want to do for me in the future. I want to come to communion with the expectation that you're going to meet with me and give me something that I can take into this week, that I can take into this month. Let's take communion today, expecting God to speak to us today. As we get ready for communion, let's pray.